How do you write an expanded story universe? The 1989 film Back to the Future Part 2 takes the events of the first film and builds out an expanded story universe by showing familiar scenes through the eyes of other characters and using these familiar scenes as milestones to create new story beats. So let's take a look at how the film accomplishes this. One of the key characters in the second film is the middle-aged Biff Tannen, who still harbors animosity toward Marty and his family. The film uses Biff to see familiar story beats from the first film, but we see them through Biff's eyes, giving us a new perspective. For example, when the film begins, we recap the ending of the first film. Doc Brown returns from the future and grabs Marty and his girlfriend Jennifer to head back to 2015 in a now flying DeLorean. But the button at the end of the scene is a new story beat. Biff walks out of the house trying to find Marty and ends up seeing the DeLorean flying across the sky. This becomes a key story point that sets up a beat later in the film. That later story beat happens in the future when an elderly Biff Tannen stumbles upon the DeLorean that Marty and Doc stash away in an alley. This much older Biff remembers seeing the flying car in 1985, and this inspires him to spy on Marty and Doc to figure out what they're doing. Once Biff learns about the time traveling and also sees the sports almanac that Marty purchases to make bets, Biff steals the car and flies back to 1955 to give the almanac to his younger self and ends up changing the timeline. We initially experience the world of 2015 through Marty's eyes, and there are many parallels to the same locales that we see in 1985 and in 1955. The filmmakers help us to orient ourselves quickly to the new environment by giving us familiar milestones like the clock tower, a scene in a diner where Marty confronts a bully, and a skateboard-inspired scene with hoverboards. The film navigates us through these beats, but it expands the story universe further by using elderly Biff to change the timeline and create a whole new world in 1985. Using the established time travel rules, the film makes use of Biff as an antagonist who has a strong motivation to want to change the timeline, and the consequence of this is a bigger story universe with new dynamics and obstacles. When Marty and Doc return to 1985 from 2015, they soon discover that middle-aged Biff is now a wealthy man who runs the town and is married to Marty's mom. Everything in Marty's world is turned upside down, and the film takes a darker tone, raising the stakes for our protagonists. We keep asking, how are they going to get out of this situation? Once again, the film effectively uses parallel story beats to help us reorient to a new timeline. For example, Marty wakes up in Biff's hotel suite, tended to by his mom, who looks very different. Later on, when Marty and Doc travel back to 1955 to figure out when the elderly Biff gave the almanac to his younger self, we see the characters reliving many moments from the first film, but seeing them from a different perspective. Marty and Doc are trying to not run into other versions of themselves to prevent further timeline disruption. But we see Marty revisiting the school dance and Doc crossing paths with another version of himself at the clock tower. In this expanded story universe, we now see that multiple versions of our characters can coexist in the same time period, and there can be major consequences from these events. These scenarios can create obstacles, such as when Marty gets knocked out at the school dance when an earlier version of himself races out the door after saying goodbye to George and Lorraine. And because we now know characters can travel back and forth through different time periods as seen in the events of the second film, we as the audience are ready to accept the ending twist when Doc is zapped back to 1885 during the thunderstorm. We see the film's logic that things from the past can exist through time and have an effect on later events. When Marty gets the message from the Western Union Courier at the film's end, we understand that Doc, who is now in the past, has sent the message to instruct Marty on next steps. So the film still has us emotionally experience the events through the main protagonists, but additional obstacles created by antagonists makes us see a bigger story universe. Through the motivated choices of our protagonists and antagonists, Back to the Future Part 2 expands the world of our characters and gives them more possibilities to explore.